If you hate uncertainty because you're autistic or just because you don't like it, you need to learn about Stephen King's Door. Stephen King is probably the greatest horror writer of all time, and in 1981, he wrote a book explaining exactly what makes things scary. And in that book is a story that explains why you find uncertainty so scary. The book is called Don's Macabre, and it has a story of a door where there's something scratching on the other side. And Stephen King explains that if you open the door and you find a 10-foot tall bug on the other side, you actually feel relief. Because, yeah, a 10-foot tall bug is scary, but before you open the door, it could have been anything. And so your mind is imagining infinite possibilities of fear. Stephen King knows that your mind will always find possibility scarier than reality. You will always find a door that could have anything behind it scarier than an opening that has a 10-foot tall bug behind it. And so if uncertainty frightens you, you need to open Stephen King's door. You need to move from possibility into reality. But of course, there are things in life that you can't know for certain. If you're afraid of how your job interview is going to go tomorrow, well, you don't actually know what's going to happen. So you might think, well, I can't help but be afraid. But you can still open Stephen King's door and reduce your anxiety by making a reasonable prediction. All you have to do is ask yourself two questions. Your first question is, what is the worst thing that could reasonably happen? You got to add that reasonably in, because if you don't, then you'll say like, well, I could fall into a pit of rattlesnakes and die. And I mean, yes, technically you could, but that's not a reasonable fear. That's not at all likely. So you want to think of the reasonable worst case scenario, which in the case of a job interview might be something like, I completely forget what to say and I totally embarrass myself and I lose the job and it feels awful. And then you take that and you ask question two, which is, if that reasonable worst case scenario were to happen, what would I do about it? And in the case of this example, the answer is probably that, well, you would feel bad about it for a couple days, and then you would do something to cheer yourself up, and then eventually you would start looking for jobs again, and eventually you would find a job. And this allows you to open Stephen King's door. Because in order to move past your fear of uncertainty, you don't need absolute certainty. You just need certainty about what the reasonable worst case scenario is. And now you've figured that out. You know that the reasonable worst thing that could happen is something that you could deal with, you could bounce back from. And so that's not preferred, but it would be okay. And so all the possibilities that you have to think about are either okay or better than okay if the worst scenario does not happen. Of course, there's times where the realistic worst case scenario really is something to be afraid of, like if you're in the middle of the jungle and you really could fall into a pit of rattlesnakes. So this technique isn't talking about those scenarios. It's also not talking about if you're autistic and you just prefer routine or predictability in your life. That's perfectly fine. This is specifically about a situation where your fear of uncertainty is causing you problems, and you might be able to realize that actually you don't need to be so afraid because you can handle the worst case realistic scenario. If you liked this video, I got more free stuff that you might like at heydrdan.com. And if you found it helpful, somebody else probably would too. So forward it on to them. Dr. Dan signing off.